Alright, homies, here we go with our next instructional math video. Today's topic is comparing and ordering rational numbers. And what we're going to remember is that we're going to be comparing and ordering a certain kind of numbers, and that certain kind of numbers is rational numbers. What we're going to remember about that is that when we talked about rational numbers, we talked about any number that can be written as a fraction. Okay, so what we're really talking about is comparing and ordering fractions in this video. One thing we also talked about was how certain fractions can be equivalent fractions. Okay, so when we talk about equivalent fractions, we're talking about fractions that are equal to each other, that have the same value. So an example would be 3/6 has the same value as 1/2 because 3 out of 6 is really half of something. Okay, but what if we had two fractions that were not equivalent? What if instead of 3/6 and 1/2 we had 3/6 and let's say 5/6? When you have two fractions and you recognize that they're not equivalent, meaning they're not equal to each other, they're not the same thing, we can now ask the question, which one is bigger? Okay, so what we're trying to figure out is what's greater, 3/6 or 5/6? Now, this particular example should be fairly easy because I think you know that having 3 of the 6 pizza slices is not as much as having 5 of the 6 pizza slices, so 5/6 is greater than 3/6. When we're comparing fractions, we're going to use alligator mouth symbols. Okay, we're going to use greater than or less than symbols in order to compare fractions, because greater than or less than symbols answer our question about which one is bigger and which one is smaller. Here's another example. If you have two fractions and those two fractions are 4/7 and 3/7, we can decide which one is bigger pretty quickly and pretty easily because you're comparing sevenths to sevenths, and if you have 4/7, you have more sevenths than if you have 3/7. This is be like saying I do something 4 times a week versus doing something 3 times a week. Doing something 4 times a week is more or greater than 3/7. Remember, the way these alligator mouths work is they're mean and they want to eat the bigger number. Okay, so they're always going to be opening up and trying to bite down on the big number of the two. So greater than signs, less than signs are what we use when we're comparing two rational numbers. In other words, comparing two fractions. This is all pretty nice and easy when you're dealing with sevenths and sevenths, but it gets a little bit trickier when you don't have a common denominator. For instance, what if instead of sevenths and sevenths, I was comparing 4/10 with 3, how about 3/8? Now all of a sudden it's kind of tricky to figure out, is 4 out of 10 more than 3 out of 8? Or is 3 out of 8 more than 4 out of 10? It's a little bit trickier and more difficult, and this is where the lesson really kicks in. We're going to have to find a way to compare fractions that have different denominators. Okay, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to try to turn them into fractions that have the same denominators. So I'm going to take this fraction, and I'm going to try to make them both have the same number here in the denominator. Okay, we've already learned how to turn 4/10 into a whole bunch of other fractions, and you can do that by timesing the top and bottom by the same number. But what number am I going to choose here? Well, I could times them both by 2, I could times them both by 3 or 4 or 5 or any number really. Okay? But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get this number to be the same as this number. In other words, I'm going to try to turn this 10 into something, and I'm going to try to turn this 8 into something so that they both match. So could I times this by 2? No, because 8 can't turn into a 20. So I'm not going to times it by 2. Could I times it by 3? No, because that would turn it into a 30, and 8 can't turn into a 30. But if I turn this into a times 4, I can turn that 10 into a 40. Let me show you that. Okay. Of course, that means that I would have to times the top of this by 4, and that 4 would turn into a 16. Now, the trick is going to be, I turned the 10 into a 40, I want to turn the 8 into a 40 as well. How do I turn an 8 into a 40? Well, I'm going to times it by, you guessed it, 5, because 8 times 5 is 40. Okay, that means if I times 8 by 5 to get 40, I've got to do the same thing to the top. I've got to do 3 times 5. 3 times 5 is 15, and now we can compare these two fractions. Now we can see which one is bigger and which one is smaller. Before we were kind of guessing if we were trying to pick 4/10 versus 3/8, but now we don't have to guess anymore. Now we see that 4/10 is excuse me, is 16/40, and 3/8 is 15/40. Well, 16 out of 40 is more than 15 out of 40. So, I could tell you now that, back to the original problem, 4/10 is greater than 3/8. Okay, we can compare those two fractions, and I can say this one wins. It is bigger. Okay, so that's how we are going to compare two fractions together, even when they don't have the same denominator. Okay, so here's a practice problem for you. I want you to try this on your own. I want you to see if you can compare 2/5 with, what should we compare 2/5 with? How about 1/7? You tell me what's bigger, 2 out of 5 or 1 out of 7? And you're going to give me a greater than sign or a less than sign somewhere in here to show me which one is bigger. Okay, this is not going to be our only practice problem for this lesson, so don't stop the video yet. Write this practice problem down and try it. Or you can pause the video right now, try this practice problem, and then finish watching the rest of the video when you're done. Okay, let's talk about how to order fractions. In other words, what if you had more than two fractions? What if I had 1/12, 7/12, and 5/12? And I wanted to put them all in order, okay? I would want to put them from least to greatest. So, I think you can tell that 1 out of 12 is the smallest, but you should probably be able to tell that 5 out of 12 is less than 7 out of 12. So if I put these in the correct order, I would have 1/12 first, then 5/12 second, then 7/12 last. Okay? What you want to notice here is when we put them in order, we're always going to go from least at the beginning to greatest at the end. That is ordering fractions. And of course it's very easy when all of your denominators match. But just like comparing fractions, it gets a little trickier when your denominators don't match. Okay, what if your three fractions were 3/8, 5/12, and let's go ahead and say your third fraction was 1/6. Okay, we've got three different fractions and we've got three different denominators. So what we're going to try to accomplish here is we're going to try to turn them into three fractions that all have the same denominator. Now what you're going to have to do is figure out what you can turn an 8 into that you can also turn a 12 into and a 6 into. Probably the best way to start this is to work with the 12 because it's the biggest. Can I double the 12? Sure. If I double the 12, I'm going to get 24. Can I turn a 6 into a 24? Yes. Can I turn an 8 into a 24? Yes. So, let's turn the 6 into a 24. 6 times 4 gives me 24. Let's turn the 8 into a 24. 8 times 3 gives me 24. Now I've got the denominators all to match, but how do I fix the numerators, the tops? Well, if I take my first one, I multiplied the bottom by 3, so I've got to do the same thing on top or else I'm cheating. 3 times 3 is 9, right? Okay, again with the second one, I multiplied the bottom by 2, so I've got to multiply the top by 2 as well. 5 times 2 is 10. Okay, you're starting to see the order that these might go in. And then we finally have to do the last one. I multiplied the bottom by 4, so I've got to multiply the top by 4 as well. What's 1 times 4? 4. Now all I have to do is put these things in order. So, what order should my three fractions go in here? Well, this one would be first. It's the smallest. This one would be second. It's the next smallest. And the largest of the three is the 10/24. But I'm going to list them the way they first were at the beginning. So the smallest one was actually 1/6. That's what I'm going to write first. Whoops, not 1/2. 1/6. Okay, that's the smallest one. The next smallest one was the 9/24, which was actually 3/8 in disguise. And then finally the biggest one was the 10/24, which was really the equivalent of the 5/12 that we started with. So now I have my three fractions that I started with, and I've rewritten them in numerical order from least to greatest. And we have just ordered those fractions in the correct order. This is called ordering fractions, and now we should be able to compare fractions and order fractions. I'm going to give you one practice problem and then let you go. Okay, I'm going to give you 3/4. I'm going to give you 7/10, and I'm going to give you 4/5. Your job is to put those three fractions in order from least to greatest. You have two practice problems today, one where you are ordering fractions and one where you are comparing fractions. We will check those answers in class tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Adios.